It was just another slow winter night at the cafe, the kind of night where the cold seemed to seep through the windows despite the heat cranked all the way up, and the streets outside were slick with patches of ice that reflected the dim, flickering streetlights. Downtown at this time of year felt empty and dangerous, even in a part of the city I'd been working in for years. There were the usual people, shivering, bundled-up strangers wandering from one homeless shelter to another, the occasional group of kids looking for trouble, and the faint scent of drugs that seemed to cling to certain corners of the street. I had worked late shifts before, seen fights break out over nothing, had people yell and threaten me, but I'd never been scared in a way that made my stomach twist and my hands shake. That night changed that. It started during a slow afternoon, when the cafe was mostly empty except for the regulars who came in for their coffee and quiet corner. A kid walked in, red hair, probably in his early 20s, skinny, with a wild energy about him that I could feel the moment he stepped into the door. He didn't order anything, didn't even sit at the bar. He went straight for one of the tables in the seating area and just stared at the wall for a minute. Then he started chanting. At first it was soft, almost inaudible, a muttering under his breath. I ignored it, thinking he might just be talking to himself, but the words didn't sound like normal speech. They were low, harsh, almost rhythmic, and carried a strange intensity that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Then he started moving his hands, waving them in patterns that didn't make sense, curling his fingers like he was trying to reach into the air itself. I watched for a moment, unsure if I should say something. People in this part of the city could be unpredictable, but what really caught my attention was the feeling of tension that seemed to radiate from him, like the air around him was charged. After a minute or two, he got up, still muttering, and started yelling, disturbing the few customers in the cafe. I swallowed, walked over, and told him he needed to leave for the day. He stopped and looked at me, eyes wide, pupils dilated, and said something that made my blood run cold. "This is all a giant game. I'll fucking kill you with one finger." I froze for a split second, but shook it off. Working downtown, you got used to hearing threats. People yelled at you, cursed at you, sometimes waved knives around. This wasn't different. I told him again to leave, and eventually he stormed out. Customers murmured behind me, some looking worried, but it all seemed like a normal day. I cleaned the counter, restocked some shelves, and tried to forget about him. By the time we were closing up, it was dark. Early winter evenings in the city can feel like night already by 6, and the streetlights didn't help much. They flickered or glowed weakly through the fog that had settled over the streets. I locked the doors, turned off the music, and grabbed my coat, planning to walk the 6 blocks to the parking garage where I kept my car. The streets were mostly empty, a few cars passing by, and the occasional shadow that could have been anything. My breath came out in visible puffs, and the crunch of snow under my boots was the only sound I made as I started walking. About a block into my walk, I noticed a hissing noise behind me. I froze, listening. It wasn't a cat, and it wasn't a car. It was low, guttural, deliberate. My heart started to beat faster. I looked around, the empty streets illuminated by pale, flickering lights. Nothing. I picked up my pace, my boots sliding slightly on the ice, my mind racing. Then I heard footsteps. Quick, hurried, but not like someone jogging. They were deliberate, following me, staying just far enough away to make me turn around constantly. My stomach sank. I knew the kid from the cafe was trouble, and for some reason, my brain immediately made the connection. I started running, careful to stay on the icy patches, heading for the staircase that led to the parking garage. I wasn't going to risk waiting for the elevator. The staircase felt like my only option, a narrow, enclosed space that might give me some control over the situation. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the door, the metal cold under my gloves. I finally got it open and ran inside, listening to the echo of footsteps behind me. A second after I closed the door, I heard it slam shut with a heavy thud. I pressed my back against the wall, heart hammering, trying to catch my breath. I made it up one floor to the level where my car was parked, each step feeling heavier than the last. The garage was quiet, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, casting harsh shadows on the concrete floor. I could see my car in the distance and picked up speed, my boots slipping slightly on the thin layer of snow that had drifted in from the entrance. When I finally reached it, I fumbled with my keys, hands numb from cold and fear, but finally got the door open and threw myself inside. I locked the doors and breathed a little easier, thinking it was over. Then I looked up. There he was, standing just a few feet away, red hair wild, face contorted with fury. He sprinted toward the car, pounding on the windows, screaming. The sound made my chest tighten, a mix of panic and disbelief. I slammed the door into him as he reached for the handle, enough to stop him for a second, and then started the engine. Tires skidded slightly as I pulled out, adrenaline making me hyper-aware of every shadow, every movement in the garage. He yelled after me, but I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was several blocks away, headlights cutting through the foggy streets. The next morning, I called the police. The kid had left a trail that made it easy for them to find him. When they tracked him down, everything I had said matched what he admitted. He genuinely believed he was part of some larger game, some twisted hierarchy, and that he had the power to hurt people with just a gesture. Small jail time and a restraining order later, and I haven't seen him since. The experience stuck with me, not just because of the fear in the moment, but because it made everything downtown feel sharper, darker, more dangerous in a way I hadn't felt before. I started leaving with co-workers, avoiding walking alone at night whenever possible, even if it meant staying later to close the cafe with someone else. I learned to trust my instincts more, to notice the patterns of the streets, the energy of people passing by. It's been years since that night, but I remember every step, every sound, every shadow. Even now, when winter rolls in and the streets go quiet, I can feel that same tension creeping in, a reminder that people can be unpredictable, dangerous, and completely unhinged. The city feels alive in a way most people don't notice. The hum of neon signs, the distant wail of sirens, the scrape of shoes on icy sidewalks. And I know, just as clearly as I did that night, that staying alert isn't paranoia. It's survival. From then on, I never underestimated anyone who seemed off, no matter how harmless they looked. I started paying closer attention to my surroundings, planning my exits, keeping my keys ready, and walking with purpose. It changed the way I moved through the city, the way I treated strangers, the way I thought about safety. That night wasn't just terrifying, it taught me a harsh but vital lesson. Some encounters can escalate fast, and sometimes the only way to stay safe is to trust your instincts, act quickly, and never take anyone's words lightly. Even years later, I still remember the redhead's face, the way he screamed, and the raw, insane intensity in his eyes. It's a memory I carry, a warning that the world isn't always rational, and that the city can feel like a dangerous place, even when it's the streets you've walked 1,000 times. But I survived. I made it to my car. I got away. And that clarity, that sharp edge of relief when I finally drove away, is something I carry with me every time I walk the city streets at night. I've never let it go. It changed me in small ways that build over years. I stay alert, I watch people, I plan. And while the city still has its chaos, its unpredictability, I know I can handle it. That night could have ended differently, but it didn't. I made it home safe, I reported the incident, and the consequences took care of themselves. I've never forgotten the lesson, and I never will. I worked overnight at Walmart for a while, mostly covering the graveyard shift from 10 at night until 7 in the morning. The store was quiet for the most part, empty aisles stretching far into shadows, with only the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional rumble of the AC to break the silence. Nights like that had a rhythm. You knew every sound the store made, every squeak of a cart, every thump of a box being set down in the back. You could hear the sliding of the automatic doors even before they opened. It was just me, a few overnight stockers, and the occasional driver dropping off shipments. It should have been boring, but it never really was. There was one thing, or rather one person, that made those nights feel off in a way that was hard to describe. Every single Friday night, without fail, this old woman would appear sometime between 10 and 11. She came with 2 little girls, maybe 6 or 7 years old, and she made herself impossible to ignore. Not in a threatening way, but in a way that made the hair on your arms stand up just a little. She was loud. Not just talking loud, but yelling loud, as if she wanted the entire store to know what she was doing. She would push a cart through the aisles, grabbing things from every section: cereal, cleaning supplies, clothes, toys, random electronics. She never seemed to care what she put in there. She would ask employees to reach things for her a few times, always pointing, always raising her voice, always moving quickly through the store with those 2 kids trailing behind her. It became a routine. Every Friday, I would see her come through the automatic doors, the wheels of her cart squeaking against the floor tiles. The kids would follow, one holding a stuffed animal, the other tugging at her sleeve. She would start in the middle aisles, grab a pile of boxes, set some down halfway through the aisle, move on to the next section, and then the next. You could see the little pile of chaos she left behind. There were moments where she would disappear for a while, leaving her cart abandoned somewhere in the store, only to reappear on the other side. No one ever tried to stop her. It wasn't that she was stealing. She would just leave the cart full of stuff and walk out of the store at the end of her night, taking nothing with her. The first few weeks, I tried to make sense of it. Was she mentally ill? Was she testing the store somehow? I never knew. It wasn't scary in a traditional sense. It was just weird, the kind of weird that lodges in your head and doesn't leave. There was no rhyme or reason to what she did. Some nights, she would fill her cart with bags of flour and detergent, then wander into the electronics section, pick up a blender, walk back to the other side, and leave everything scattered along the aisle. I would watch from the registers or the stockroom, cleaning up the mess and wondering why she was even there. The kids didn't complain, didn't cry, didn't even seem all that aware of the chaos. They just followed her, copying her every move in silence. One night, though, it got different. I had been stocking the shelves near the household section when I saw her again. This time, her movement was slower, uncoordinated. She looked spaced out, her eyes unfocused. Her voice wasn't the usual loud yelling. It was barely there, a soft mumble that didn't make sense. One of her kids was tugging at her hand, saying things like, "Hey, can you hear me? It's me. Why aren't you talking to me?" Over and over, with that same worried little voice that made your stomach twist. She didn't respond. She walked through the aisles, her cart half empty, half full, bumping into things without stopping. The kid kept calling out, following her, repeating his words. It was heartbreaking to watch, and I couldn't do anything but stand there, frozen, watching as the scene unfolded in the cold, harsh light of the store. Those nights left a mark on me. Not in a dramatic, horrifying way, but in a quiet, uncomfortable way that lingered. You start to notice details, the way her hands shook when she reached for the items, the way the kid's small shoulders slumped a little more with each step, the silence between her words that was somehow louder than any shouting. It was real, it was human, and it was sad in a way you can't just ignore. Eventually, I stopped wondering about her reasons. I stopped trying to figure out why she came every Friday, why she left her cart, why she moved through the store like a storm that left nothing but scattered goods behind. I just accepted it as part of the rhythm of the night shift, like the hum of the lights or the echo of carts on the tiles. It became routine to see her, to watch her from the stockroom, to know the chaos she would leave in her wake. By the time I left Walmart, I had seen her every Friday for months, always the same pattern, always the same children, always leaving her cart somewhere in the store and walking away without taking anything. I never confronted her, never tried to stop her, and never understood her. But I remember the nights vividly. I remember the quiet dread that settled over me as I watched her disappear through the sliding doors, leaving a cart full of items and two kids who didn't complain, just followed. I remember the loneliness of the store after she left, the echo of her voice, and the weight of knowing that people can be complicated and sad in ways you might never understand. Even now, thinking back, it sticks with me, not as a ghost story, not as some supernatural thing, but as a very human story of despair, chaos, and the strange ways people move through the world. She was gone when I quit, of course, but those nights stayed with me, more real than any horror, more haunting than anything I could imagine. It wasn't fear that made it stick. It was understanding that sometimes the world just doesn't make sense, and some people carry their chaos with them, week after week, silently, and no one can change it. The story ended for me the day I left the job, but her routine remained, rolling through the aisles, a puzzle no one would solve, and a reminder that real life can be stranger and heavier than any story you could make up. I worked night shifts at an amusement park during the winter when the place was completely closed for the season. The rides were covered with tarps, the pathways were cracked and littered with dead leaves, and the entire park had this heavy, still silence that made every creak of metal or whisper of wind feel enormous. Most nights weren't too bad, especially since I wasn't alone. There were always two of us on shift, which helped, because the park is massive and it's easy to feel completely swallowed up by the darkness when you're out there by yourself. That winter, I was assigned to drive around the park in one of the maintenance trucks, making sure everything was secured, checking the rides, and walking through the buildings to make sure nothing was broken or tampered with. The other person I worked with stayed in the passenger seat, notebook in hand, tracking what we'd checked so far. The first hour or so of that night was uneventful. The wind was biting, colder than usual, and the dark stretched across the park like it could pull you in. Every ride looked different at night. Even rides I'd been on 100 times during the summer seemed strange and alien when the lights were off and the metal frames were silhouetted against the moonlight. The Ferris wheel towered over everything, skeletal and quiet, its carriages hanging motionless like frozen teeth in the air. The carousel looked abandoned and sad, the animals' painted faces faded, their eyes seeming almost lifelike under the dim glow of the moon. I liked the quiet at first. It made the park feel like it belonged to me, like I had a little piece of the world to walk through and keep safe. We drove slowly at first, the truck's headlights cutting through the shadows, casting long, exaggerated forms across the ground. The other person, and I joked quietly about how weird it would be if one of the rides suddenly came alive at night. The joke faded fast when the first phone rang. It came from the Ferris wheel control booth. A loud, shrill ringing that echoed against the metal, bouncing off the empty pathways. The sound made my stomach drop. I glanced at the other person, who froze and stared at me with wide eyes. We hadn't heard anything like it before. The booth should have been empty, all the park phones disconnected for the season. Yet there it was ringing. We parked the truck and walked cautiously toward the booth. The phone rang once more before cutting off. No dial tone, no voice, nothing. I picked it up, half expecting someone to be on the line, but there was just silence. The hairs on my arms stood up. We shrugged it off, assuming maybe a maintenance oversight, a leftover connection, something simple. It was just a single phone, after all. We got back in the truck and started moving toward the next area. That's when it began happening again. A phone in the arcade building started ringing. Then another on the bumper car ride. Then the one in the old ticket office. Not all at once, but staggered, as if each one was following us, waiting for us to get near before it rang. Every time we slowed down to check it, the ringing would stop, and the phone would be dead silent. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone was calling in remotely, testing lines, maintenance trying to make sure phones worked before the next season. Maybe it was an elaborate prank by the day staff. But when we counted, there were at least 20, maybe 30 phones across the park that rang at some point that night. Every phone had a different number, different voice, different pattern of ringing. The randomness of it made it worse. It didn't sound like a coordinated prank. It sounded alive. The wind picked up and whistled through the empty rides, through the skeletons of the roller coasters. Our headlights caught on the metal tracks, and the shadows they cast seemed to twist and stretch as we drove past. Every time a phone rang, it was louder than before, sharper, impossible to ignore. I remember gripping the steering, while so tightly my knuckles went white. My partner in the passenger seat kept muttering under his breath, trying to make sense of it all, but even he looked scared. We decided to check the control office near the entrance. Maybe we could find a central line, a single point where these calls were originating. Maybe it was a maintenance system gone haywire, some kind of glitch. When we got there, everything was completely off. No lights, no computers, nothing that could explain what we were hearing. The phones were all normal-looking, old push-button models. No ringer modifications, no odd wiring, nothing. Yet the ringing continued, as if the entire park had suddenly developed a mind of its own. By this point, I was sweating despite the cold. My heart kept hammering. Every time we passed a building or a ride, a phone would start ringing seconds later, as if it had been waiting for us. There was no pattern, no predictable timing. Sometimes it was in the building we had just left. Sometimes it was far across the park. We could hear the echoing, overlapping rings, a chaotic orchestra of tones, all different, all unrelenting. We drove slower, cautiously, trying to stay calm, but the feeling was impossible to shake. The park felt huge, endless, and we were trapped inside. The headlights cut through the darkness, but the shadows seemed to stretch in every direction. The wind carried strange creaks and groans from the rides, and the ringing phones layered over it all, creating a sensory overload that made it almost impossible to focus. Every instinct I had told me to get out of there, to drive back to the main gate, to call the manager and quit on the spot. But it was late, and the roads out of the park were narrow and winding. If we sped up, the phones seemed to follow, their rings sharpening, shrill and angry, almost mocking. Hours passed like this. Each time we thought we had found the source, the ringing would migrate somewhere else. Exhaustion started to take over. My eyes burned from staring at the dark roads, my ears were ringing from the overlapping tones, and my hands ached from gripping the wheel. My partner suggested taking a break, maybe letting the phones stop on their own. We parked near the roller coaster, lights off, and just sat, listening. It was the longest 30 minutes of my life. The ringing stopped for a while, enough to think maybe it was over. Then, faintly at first, then louder, the phones began ringing again, but now closer, in buildings we hadn't even driven past yet. It was as if the entire park had become one gigantic system of phones, each one connected invisibly, and somehow aware of our location. I realized then that whatever this was, it wasn't random. It wasn't a prank in the normal sense. It was mechanical, electrical, but somehow almost sentient in the way it knew we were moving, tracking us. The realization was terrifying. I tried to focus, to rationalize, but the sheer scale of it made it impossible. Then, out of desperation, we decided to drive to the maintenance shed near the park entrance. Maybe if we shut down the main power grid, we could stop it. The drive was tense, every second anticipating another ring. When we arrived, we went straight to the breaker panel. The shed was small, cold, and smelled like old grease and dust. I reached for the main switch, my hands shaking, the weight of the night pressing down on me. I flipped it. The silence that followed was almost painful. No ringing, no wind echo, nothing but the cold air in the shed. I looked at my partner, who was pale and trembling. We stayed there for a few minutes, listening, waiting for it to start again. But nothing came. The park was dead silent. We drove out of the park slowly, keeping an eye on every building. Not a single phone rang after we left the grounds. The feeling of being followed, tracked, hunted by the ringing phones, faded with the distance. When we got to the main gate, we parked and sat for a few minutes, letting ourselves breathe for the first time all night. The next day, management checked the lines. There was no evidence of any malfunction. No calls, no wiring issues, no explanation. It was as if it had all been a perfect, inexplicable anomaly, a night where the entire park had become alive in a way we couldn't understand. I never worked another winter night shift at that park. I didn't need to. I couldn't forget the sound of those phones, the way they followed us, the helplessness of being trapped in that empty, silent place while something so mundane became utterly terrifying. Even now, years later, I still picture the long shadows of the rides, the frozen Ferris wheel, and the relentless, impossible ringing echoing through the dark. It was over when the power was cut, but the memory never leaves. I've been on night shift for most of my career in the Air Force, and over time, you get used to the emptiness and the quiet that comes with being alone on the flight line at 2 or 3 in the morning. It's a different kind of quiet, though. Not the calm you get during the day when things are still moving around you. This is the kind of quiet that presses in from every angle, the kind that makes your own breathing and footsteps sound loud, and the dark feels like it has weight. You learn to respect it, and you learn that when you're out there alone, mistakes can be more than just inconvenient, they can be dangerous. One night, I was assigned a loxing job. Loxing is when you service the aircraft with liquid oxygen for the pilots. It's one of the riskier maintenance jobs because liquid oxygen is extremely cold and highly reactive. One slip could cause frostbite or worse, and when you're the only one allowed near the plane, you have to be completely aware of what you're doing. Nobody else is supposed to be close, so you're isolated, and that isolation can make you tense. That night, the aircraft I was assigned to was on the far side of the ramp, away from the rest of the squadron. I remember noticing the extra dark stretch of tarmac that separated me from everyone else, and a subtle unease settled in, though I brushed it off because I'd worked alone on worse nights. I suited up in the full protective gear. The gloves are thick, the face shield can fog up if you're moving around too fast, and the insulated coveralls make you sweat even when the air is cold. Every time I put the suit on, there's that brief feeling of claustrophobia, like you're encased in armor. Then you remember why you're wearing it, and it's a necessary discomfort. I double-checked my connections, my gauges, and my grounding cable before I even approached the aircraft. The LOX truck was parked nearby, its hoses coiled and ready, and the lights from the ramp reflected off the metal of the plane. Even though the rest of the field was dark, the plane itself seemed to glow in that artificial light, and for a moment, it felt monumental. I started the servicing. The process requires a steady hand and careful attention. The valve connections have to be perfect, the flow rate must be controlled, and the documentation afterward has to be precise. While handling locks, you are constantly aware of the danger. You watch the frost forming on the hoses and the fittings, the way the metal glints, the quiet hiss of pressure equalizing. Even though I've done this hundreds of times, there's always a part of your mind that knows that a sudden mistake could hurt you or destroy equipment. I finished the initial servicing, and the next step was to climb into the cockpit to record the numbers for the forms. The cockpit of this aircraft is narrow, filled with switches, gauges, and panels. My boots clomped against the metal steps, and I felt the vibration of the engines still settling in the ramp's cold air. I reached for the canopy, lifted it, and climbed in. The isolation felt heavier inside the cockpit, surrounded by panels and shadows. The ramp lights barely reached in there, and every corner looked like it could hide a mistake waiting to happen. As I was turning the power on to record the readings, I heard it. A sound that made my stomach flip before I even realized what it was. The noise came from every direction at once, a terrifying, unnatural hiss that sounded like it had erupted from the plane itself. In the dark, in the quiet, in that confined cockpit, it felt like the sound was swallowing me. My chest tightened, my heart slammed, and every instinct screamed at me that something was seriously wrong. I froze, half expecting to see flames or a cloud of gas. Then I realized what had happened. The shutoff valve where I had been servicing the locks had frozen itself open. The liquid oxygen was now escaping uncontrollably, spilling across the ramp, the aircraft, and my suit. I could feel the cold seeping through even the layers of protective clothing, a biting frost that made me flinch and step back. My first thought was panic, the irrational kind that makes your mind scramble. I was alone. The plane was massive, the ramp empty, and there was locks pouring out everywhere. I had to get out of the cockpit fast. The hissing seemed endless, echoing off the metal surfaces, and I had a fleeting fear that the sound itself would be the thing that caused an accident. I grabbed my way out of the cockpit, boots sliding on the icy metal where the locks had landed. The air was thick with a cold bite that made my lungs sting. I had to remove some of the excess frost from my gloves to manipulate the valve, my hands stiff and clumsy. Every second felt like an hour as I struggled to reach the shutoff, the cold biting harder with each movement. Eventually, I managed to stop the flow. The hiss subsided to a faint echo, and the immediate danger passed. But the damage had been done. My suit was soaked in liquid oxygen, frozen and stiff. My gloves were useless, my face shield fogged up from my own rapid breathing. I had to carefully strip off the suit, exposing myself to the cold night air while trying not to slip on the slick patches forming around me. My pants were ruined, stiff and frostbitten from exposure, and I had to change into fresh clothing before I could continue. The night stretched on as I unpacked spare suits from the truck, my movements deliberate and methodical to avoid further accidents. Once I was dressed in dry clothing, I returned to the aircraft. The valve had been checked, and I went through the locksing procedure again, slower this time, meticulously watching every gauge, every frost formation, every hiss of escaping gas. I moved deliberately, conscious of every step and aware that rushing could lead to another disaster. I double-checked the readings, triple-checked the connections, and finally closed the valve with careful precision. It was done correctly this time. The plane sat quiet and stable in the faint light of the ramp. I sat back for a moment, exhausted. The adrenaline was still pumping, my gloves and boots heavy from the moisture in the air. I looked across the ramp, seeing the empty expanse, the other aircraft dimly lit in the distance, and felt the deep relief that comes with surviving a night like that. No one else had been nearby, and no one had been hurt. The danger had been real and immediate, but I had handled it. I checked the forms, recorded the numbers, and slowly began to pack up my equipment. By the time I finished, the night had started to lighten. The first hints of dawn were brushing the horizon, washing the ramp in pale colors. The world that had felt enormous, dark, and threatening only hours earlier now seemed normal and mundane again. I walked back to my vehicle, tired but satisfied that the job had been done properly and safely. I reflected on the sheer intensity of the night, the fear, the physical discomfort, and the need for complete focus. Nights like this remind you why the procedures are so strict, why isolation is necessary, and why respect for the work is non-negotiable. In the end, I returned the lock's equipment, cleaned up the mess on the ramp, and signed out. There was no fanfare, no congratulations, just the quiet satisfaction that comes from completing a dangerous task correctly. I went home, changed into warm clothes, and finally allowed myself to relax. It had been a long, tense night, but I had survived, done my job, and learned a little more about patience, focus, and respect for the hazards that come with working on the flight line. Nights like that leave you exhausted, but they also leave you with a sense of accomplishment that's hard to find anywhere else. I used to work at a small pub that was about 2 miles from my house, out in the middle of nowhere. It was the kind of place that felt safe during the day, familiar and comfortable, but at night, when everything was quiet and the dark crept in, it could feel completely different. One night, I finished my shift around 11. The night had been exceptional for tips. I had made close to $400 in cash, which was a lot for me at the time. I decided to stay a little longer after my shift, have a couple of drinks to wind down, and let the alcohol calm my nerves before I started walking home. It was a clear choice at the time. I knew the route, it was just 2 miles, and I felt like I had everything under control. The walk started fine. Just a quarter mile from the pub, there was a single streetlight. Its pale glow cut through a small circle of darkness, giving me some comfort as I moved away from the pub. Beyond that one light, the rest of the walk was in complete darkness. It was a new moon, so the night sky offered almost nothing. The clouds overhead blocked even the faintest hint of starlight, leaving the surrounding countryside in a heavy blackness. There was no light pollution out here, no town lights in the distance to guide me. It was just me, the road, and the quiet hum of the night. I hadn't gone far when I noticed a car slowly driving past me. I didn't pay it much attention at first. It wasn't unusual for someone to be out this late, but something about the way it moved made me pause. It was moving too slow to be just driving by, and as it passed, I saw it slow to a stop a little further down the road. The car just sat there, motionless. I stopped walking, trying to figure out what it was doing. A sense of unease began to creep in. I wasn't imagining it, the car was waiting. After a few minutes, it slowly drove away, the tires crunching on the gravel softly, disappearing into the darkness. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was probably nothing. Maybe someone was lost or checking directions. Maybe they had broken down, I don't know. A couple of minutes later, I heard the faint hum of a motor again. My stomach dropped when I saw the same car coming back toward me in the opposite lane. It passed me slowly, but then it drove a little further down the road and stopped again. My heart began to race. The next moment made my blood run cold. The car did a slow U-turn and started creeping back toward me, headlights off. It was impossible to see, but I could sense it. I could feel it moving in the darkness, coming closer without warning. My mind raced. I didn't have a cell phone at the time, no one around to call for help. The pub was behind me, the car between me and safety, and my house was still 1.5 miles away. There was no way I could run that distance fast enough, not with whatever this was. I had to think fast. Instinct took over. I ran off the road into the woods, stumbling through the uneven ground, branches slapping against my arms and face, my legs scraping against roots. I ducked down behind a thick bush, pressing myself against the cold, damp earth. I tried to control my breathing, forcing myself to stay as quiet as possible. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I watched the road as best I could, trying to spot the car through the dense darkness. I couldn't see anything. The blackness seemed to swallow every shape, every shadow. I stayed there for what felt like forever. My arms were scratched and my clothes were torn from the underbrush, but I didn't care. I couldn't stop thinking about the money in my pocket, about the possibility that whoever was in that car knew exactly how much I was carrying. 10 minutes passed, maybe more, and still there was nothing. I began to consider making my move back to the road. Maybe it was safe now. Maybe the person had gone. I took a deep breath, readying myself to stand up when I heard it. The sound of car doors closing, metal clicking shut, faint but distinct. My stomach dropped. Panic hit me like a wave. The hairs on the back of my neck stood straight up. My chest felt like it was being crushed. I pressed myself harder against the earth, heart hammering in my chest, trying to slow my breathing. Every noise in the forest felt amplified. A twig snapping under a branch, leaves rustling in the slight wind. It could be them. I imagined someone creeping through the trees, coming for me. I stayed frozen. Time seemed to stretch, seconds turning into minutes. I forced myself to be still, to remain silent, telling myself that if I stayed hidden, if I didn't move, they might not find me. I didn't know what they wanted, didn't know what could happen if they did. My mind raced with every possible scenario, each one worse than the last. Eventually, I heard car doors again, followed by the sound of cars passing on the road. It was far enough away to be reassuring. I waited a few more minutes, trying to make sure it wasn't some trick of my imagination. Then I slowly eased back to the road, keeping my head low, listening for any hint of the car. When I finally stepped into the faint glow of the lone streetlight, I exhaled, relief washing over me. I didn't run toward my house. I didn't even try to continue the rest of the walk. I ran back to the pub as fast as I could, adrenaline and fear driving me through the dark countryside. Once inside, I told my boss what had happened, trying to explain everything that had terrified me. He didn't yell, didn't seem shocked, just very serious. From that moment on, he said, I was never walking home at night again. Either he, his brother, or his mother would drive me. When the other servers and kitchen staff heard the story, everyone agreed. No one ever questioned it. It was obvious to everyone that it had been a close call, a situation that could have ended very badly. After that night, I never walked home at night again. I didn't take the risk. The fear I felt was still vivid in my memory for weeks, months, even years. Every time I walked past that quarter-mile stretch where the streetlight stood alone, I remembered the darkness beyond it, the way I had felt exposed and hunted. The memory of the car slowly approaching in the pitch black, with its lights off, is one that stayed with me. It changed the way I thought about walking alone, the way I viewed the quiet country roads, and the illusion of safety in the familiar. It's hard to describe the relief I felt after that night. I realized how quickly a normal, routine walk could turn into something that felt like a fight for survival. The sense of safety I had taken for granted vanished in an instant. I learned to respect the dark, to respect how isolated and vulnerable you can be when there's no one around. It made me more cautious, more aware. I started leaving the pub only when there was a ride waiting, and I refused to carry that much cash on me alone after dark again. The fear didn't disappear overnight, but eventually it became a lesson I carried with me. I never forgot that night, and I never underestimated the danger of a quiet road, a dark night, and a stranger in a car. The clarity of the lesson stayed with me. I knew that I had been lucky. It could have been much worse. And that luck, that narrow escape, is what changed me. I still work nights sometimes, still finish late, but I always make sure I have a safe way to get home. That night taught me the value of caution, the importance of paying attention to my surroundings, and the need to trust my instincts when something doesn't feel right. I never again took for granted the feeling of safety or the comfort of being able to get home without fear. It was a hard lesson, one that I learned the hard way, but it shaped how I approached life afterward. That night remains one of the scariest experiences I've ever had, and it's one I will never forget. It taught me that fear is real, danger is real, and that sometimes being prepared and cautious is the only thing standing between you and disaster. From that night on, I made sure I never walked alone after dark, and I never underestimated the quiet, empty roads that stretched between the places I felt safe and the places I called home. I never want to feel that helplessness again, the raw, unfiltered fear of being completely alone, completely vulnerable, and completely in the dark.